The early presence of the Norse in North America has, since its rise to popular knowledge in the late 1800s, become something of a glamorized curiosity within not only historian circles, but across much of pop culture as well. And yet, over a century later, we only seem to know slightly more than we did before. We know for certain the Vikings were here, at least in eastern Canada, but there's still tremendous speculation as to how far these Scandinavian visitors explored, how long they stayed, and in fact, what they did in their time here. A major contributing factor to this set of circumstances is the fact that the Norse, for a large chunk of history, did not keep detailed records within their own communities, relying instead on the passing down of stories from generation to generation, making of Norse history almost as much legend as it is documentation. The best records we have today are those produced by other observing societies, often with a negative bias toward what were perceived as senseless raiders, but additionally we've begun to use modern technologies to uncover and decipher traces of this fascinating civilization, and compare said discoveries against both surviving legends and documents written down long after the fact to better understand the timeline of the Norse. In the case of North America, things become even more hazy, as only one Viking site has been confirmed as authentic, and still this is one deemed unlikely to have been a sustainable settlement for a population of more than 100. Despite this, Norse accounts describe environments rather distinct from this region, even when conditions of historic climate change are taken into account. Even more so, it is known that voyages to the New World did continue on a small scale for purposes of resource extraction for a period which could have been as long as 400 years. And it is thought that the Newfoundland site might not have been a briefly used settlement, but a rest and resupply stop for resource gathering voyages. Given the differing accounts and descriptions of the environment, it's quite possible multiple Norse voyages could have landed as far south as modern-day New York and New Jersey, be it for purposes of exploration or simply being taken far off course. All the while, more generous assumptions believe landings even further south were possible based on one account which described a land that had snowless winters. Viking tales seem to interpret North America as three major segments, one which is represented by the extreme north, a mostly uninhabitable land of ice and stone, possibly conjoined to Greenland. Second was a realm of snowy forests which provided a seemingly endless supply of lumber, this correlating to modern-day Quebec, Labrador, and potentially Newfoundland, the latter of which is most commonly attributed to the third realm, known as Vinland, where temperatures were moderate and crops grew plentifully, particularly wheat and grapes. Much like the first realm was believed to be connected to Greenland, Vinland was believed to extend southward until it eventually reconnected with Africa, reinforcing the idea that the Norse explored the hotter, more tropical regions of North America to arrive at this conclusion. Regardless of how far this exploration took the Norse, records show that by the time the rest of Europe arrived to colonize the New World, there weren't many traces of them left. Further attempts by the new unified Scandinavian kingdoms to settle North America at this point turned up fruitless, leaving them with only Greenland, Iceland, and a number of small local islands to their colonial legacy. But what if that changed? What if in an alternate timeline the Vikings never left North America and successfully established a sustainable settlement? Once again, it's difficult to say with absolute certainty what transpired within North America during this period of Norse exploration, but based on what we have found as well as the trends of previous colonization efforts in Greenland, Iceland, and the Faroe Islands, we can make a fair assumption as to the direction and drives that would propel this hypothetical colony forward. Firstly, it's commonly believed that settlement of North America failed to gain traction among the Norse because of the poor prospects uncovered in Greenland. Leif Erickson, the supposed first to discover the New World, was after all the son of the man who had sold Greenland as an enticing land rich in opportunities, only for conditions to be relatively harsher than that which was left behind. This isn't to be misunderstood as Greenland being despised for its misleading name. Settlers were still happy to find new land open to them, but conditions generally remained stagnant if not worsened as the climate became increasingly cold, dealing a major blow to their small and still developing economy. As the colony became neglected by the fatherland and less capable of sustaining itself, so did it simply become less favorable to other alternatives. This neglect from the Scandinavian mainland also contributed to a decline in colonial efforts, as Greenland, at the time seen as the frontier of Norse settlement, already lacked self-sustaining resources, making it only more costly to settle as time went on, thus leaving a much smaller population to potentially expand westward. Additionally, as this resource strain and harsh environment was the case for Greenland, new settlers were of course reluctant to go one step beyond those conditions and settle in the unknown that was America. From what is known about Norse colonization, we find a number of parallels between its own motivations and what occurred in England to drive similar efforts there. From religious persecution to disagreements with changing government, to simple desires for more farming and trade opportunities. These factors were alive and well in Scandinavia, most especially Norway, which had been a launching off point for most early colonization efforts. By the late 800s, Harald Fairhair had successfully conquered various petty kingdoms and chiefdoms across western Scandinavia to establish himself as the first High King of Norway. His rule brought about a level of centralization and restructuring never before seen in the region, leading several of his not only political rivals to flee to the then unclaimed frontier of Iceland, but also several farmers who felt overburdened by his newly established tax code, not to mention various individuals who simply opposed the concept of a centralized ruler. Like the English-American colonies, Iceland would establish a representative assembly system not long after, and function as a mostly independent body. Domestic matters would become increasingly more polarized as Christianity was quickly being introduced into the traditionally Norse pagan kingdom. Leif Erickson himself would be baptized into the new faith by the king and sent to Greenland for the purpose of converting the rest of the population sometime before he would stumble upon North America. With that in mind, there come two major possibilities with which to trigger this greater colonization effort. Option 1 would suggest that, like Spain, Norway sees an opportunity to spread the faith further by introducing it to the native population, eventually seeing missionary settlements develop into larger colonies, which take advantage of the bountiful resources available. However, this would assume that Norway has an interest in spreading the faith to a far-off land before its own, which might not be too likely. And additionally, without the immediate appeal of tremendous riches to be gathered, this might be dismissed as an effort not worth the trouble. And in fact, a proposition like this could have easily been something which transpired in our world, but was simply lost to time. Option 2 would instead suggest that the conversion attempts by Erickson are received very poorly in Greenland, where the population is already growing tired of the difficult environment, yet is increasingly dissatisfied with the king and his new rule. Iceland at the time had also just initiated a Christianization process, after repeated pressure by the monarchy, and not long after it would find itself fully submitting to the authority of the overseas government. A policy of one religion and one law would be put forward, mandating conversion across the whole of the island. Like Greenland in this alternate timeline, Iceland receives these demands far more poorly, and the reaction takes on an extreme character. Essentially, we're proposing that the populations of Iceland and Greenland resist mainland demands for Christianization and consolidation of authority, doing so by instead distancing themselves to the promising western lands which Erickson had reported on, leaving the old colonies, Greenland especially, to be in most part abandoned, with little likelihood for the mainland to resettle them to a similar capacity. We'll be taking the second route for this video, as realistically such a reaction would not be far out of place. The taking of Christianity, as it was called by the mostly pagan Iceland, nearly caused a civil war in our timeline, as a matter of fact. Statues were being torn down and sanctuaries leveled to rubble across the country. It's believed that the only reason the policy even passed was because of the few converted. Most had been in leadership positions of some sort, and the leadership who hadn't converted had seen their families overseas held hostage by the king. Norway had already cut off all support and trade to Iceland, leaving them with little to lose. Icelanders might first migrate to Greenland, but find little difference there, as much of the upper class was also seeing conversion at the time. Regardless of if that was the case, it'd become fairly clear soon enough that there weren't sufficient resources to support this new population, and so a second voyage would press on for Ericsson's supposed Vinland. We could expect an initial colony population of a few thousand, with many more to come as Norwegian influence gained in Greenland, and the colony itself advanced into a more attractive settlement. Before that happened, a reliable food supply would need to be identified, hunters venturing out to get a sense of the local game, fishers gathering a healthy supply of salmon, which Erickson had reported to be large and plentiful in the area, while local crops were harvested and stored for later use. Domestic animals would also be brought along from Iceland and Greenland for future farming projects. The Norse settlers might anticipate a retaliation by the crown, but also recognize that given the tremendous distance that they would need to traverse, the risk of invasion would be relatively low, and so construct their settlement on a coast in the typical Viking fashion, but specifically upon one which would be easily defendable from an unlikely attack. Also seeing the construction of a secured port for the receiving of new settlers, storage of ships, and catching of fish. Resources might also be gathered from the other American realms if lumber or stone was lacking in the region of settlement. Interactions with natives are sure to be mixed, with some resulting in trade or cooperation, whilst others might easily devolve into or be initiated by conflicts. In our world, Ericsson's encampment is claimed by one telling to have briefly traded with a group of natives, but stressed an importance on not trading weapons, indicating a recognition that the Vikings held superior weaponry, and did not want to risk their weapons being used against them, or worse yet, being duplicated by the native tribes. As much we might expect the same from these settlers, although this might change in times of great desperation. In regards to weapons, there'd certainly be no shortage of them among the settlers, as Norse tradition dictated that every free man own at least a few, and carry one on their person regularly. In regards to relations with the native tribes, this can be a bit of a tricky prediction. The Norse have historically had an irregular reputation when it came to matters of cultural integration, as in Normandy we find not only cooperation with the Franks, but embracing of their foreign faith, language, and a number of their customs very quickly, whereas in Greenland this was almost non-existent on the part of the Norse, and the same of Iceland, where Norse culture overwhelmed the meager Celtic population which had migrated there. Given that the Norse would consider themselves more advanced than the natives as they did in Greenland and Iceland, they're more likely than not to resist integration or embracing of native customs, even more so as the preserving of their faith and culture would have been their prime motivator for colonization. That being said, this could initially hinder them as it would mean turning away the practices which did help the natives to survive in their environment, forcing the Norse to come to these discoveries mostly on their own, not to mention encounter regular competition and hostilities with the natives. However, in the long term, this would have been worth it to maintain their cohesion as a group, and perhaps lead to new discoveries even unknown to the natives. Finally, on the matter of culture, this Norse colony would in fact retain the pagan traditions of the Vikings, while Scandinavia itself became increasingly more Christian. This cultural divide would ensure that once communication and friendly relations were re-established between the crown and the colony, there'd be little to no chance of reunion save for through conquest. Some might argue that this Norse pagan society would be incapable of establishing the same level of sustainable government as that overseas, and this is perhaps the case on a long enough timeline and in regards to levels of organization. However, the unifying actions of Harald Fairhair as well as the establishment of the Icelandic Parliament demonstrate that even if lagging behind and requiring more trial and error, effective governing structure is achievable in such a society. Interestingly enough, the Viking governing structure is regarded as one of the most effective early decentralized models, although this being said, it would certainly need to undergo a series of changes to keep the new colony afloat in the long term. Laws in most Viking societies weren't even codified or written down, mind you, but were instead entrusted upon a law speaker to memorize and recite. It's possible that, just as the distance from the crown led English colonists to adopt more democratic practices, the additional demands for responsible organization hoisted upon the Norse colony would lead to the adoption of more centralized governing structure, another step above the Icelandic assembly perhaps, seeing to the appointing of a high king with lesser kings or chiefs serving beneath him as representatives of the community and later other settlements as the colony expanded. This progressive centralization would especially be the case for the more developed parts of the colony, likely on the coasts, which, as most societies tend to do, would shift their focus to self-development and increasing of local efficiency, but there's no telling how long it would take for these coastal settlements to become fully realized cities under the Viking model. Regardless, the colony would have plenty of time, as over the next few centuries the northern waters would become more difficult to traverse due to the changing climate, and following the failure of a number of invasions meant to bring the Norse Americans back under crown rule, the Norwegian king and later the Danish king would consider it a lost cause, leaving the colony in most part to its own devices. It might be suggested that the Viking settlement of the Americas would trigger an early colonization effort by the European powers. However, the underdeveloped navies of what would become Europe's great powers would be woefully underprepared to take on such an effort, even if they wanted to. Moreover, Scandinavia had always maintained a fair disconnect from the rest of Western Europe, and still would in this world. Tales of their island settlers one day taking off west and never returning wouldn't set off many more alarms than Ericsson's initial voyage, or the multiple alleged resource voyages carried out over multiple centuries, meaning again the Norse Americans would be existing free of European interference for quite a time. And in that time would expand along neighboring coasts and inland, something which would likely drive them into conflict with the Algonquin people, who might well become a long-standing rival. Disease, along with overwhelming metal-based weaponry, would deal a great blow to these rival tribes, forcing many of them south or westward, where they would only come into further conflict with the tribes of those regions. The Norse Americans would, within their domain, re-establish old trades of crafting, metalwork, and shipbuilding, improving upon each of these over time, albeit at a slower rate than their contemporaries overseas. Various Norse communities along the northeast would come to develop distinct characters and codes, yet at the same time maintain interconnectivity through regular trade and travel by ship to one another's growing port cities. As we mentioned before, these cities would see implementation of more codified law, while the outer colony remained under traditional unwritten Viking law. Native tribes would become prominent targets for raids and serve as a force for the Norse to remain united against, that as well as the forces of Europe, which soon enough would stumble upon the Americas. Spanish and Portuguese colonies carry on mostly unhindered, as Norse influence would remain confined to the northeast. However, French, English, and Dutch colonists would be faced with a far more advanced challenge than that which was posed by the natives. A challenge which was already resistant to European diseases, possessed weaponry nearly on par with their own, held a deep pre-existing animosity toward Christianity, and embodied perhaps as much savagery as the most vicious of the American tribes. North America would not have become a European colony in the traditional sense, but a new nation built upon an identity the rest of Europe had left behind, and which many across Europe still feared. Upon its discovery, there'd be little doubt that North America would become a target for nearly every major European power, for not only occupying valuable land, but for representing a remnant of a heretical belief system thought long done away with. Likewise, the Norse Americans would not be driven from their new home so easily, not after having had their homes taken from them time and time before. And that is where I'll end this video for now. The US of Z thanks you for watching. Pick up a copy of our novel, I Am Uncle Sam, in the links below. Support your Legion by liking and sharing the video, or join our ranks by subscribing for more. Mr. Z, out.